Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Dr. Rommel Geronimo. I guess we didn't do an introduction. I guess we did do an introduction last time. But anyways, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Rommel Geronimo, and I specialize in functional medicine, and I am also a chiropractic neurologist. This is the second part of our series on the blood chemistry panel. We're going to specifically focus on the thyroid panel. Okay, now again, I don't want you to look at this independently as its own thing. You really have to look at the big picture of where this puzzle belongs. Okay, it is a big piece to the puzzle, but you can't just isolate it. It's a big part of the picture, and you've really got to consider that. You've got to look at the rest of your blood markers to really makes any sense out of what's going on with this specific thyroid panel. But I wanted to go over this because most conventional medical labs, they don't really do a comprehensive metabolic or comprehensive thyroid panel. The most that you might get is either a TSH or maybe a T4, and if you're lucky, you might get a T3. But I'm going to show you guys what a full thyroid panel is, and then hopefully how to interpret them so that you have a better idea of what's going on with your thyroid. Oh, before I get going, a few of the questions I wanted to address from last time. I've gotten a few questions on whether or not I have a YouTube channel, and yes, I do. If you look up my name, you'll find a couple of YouTube videos that I've done. A few are kind of whiteboard or chalkboard videos explaining cellular inflammation, and I've done a few on just basic autoimmune thyroid issues as well. But I do have a YouTube channel, and it's as easy as just searching my name on YouTube. Okay, email address. My email address is info@sdbraincenter.com. Either I or my assistant might be answering those questions, but we are doing another 5 free lab readings. I think the mods are going to pick who those 5 free labs are. We did 20 the first time, and that got kind of crazy with the scheduling and coordinating and when to do these things. So I think 5 is very, very doable. So we're going to stick with that. Okay. All right. So moving on to the thyroid panel. So let's go and just kind of get to look at the big picture of what's going on with the thyroid here. Okay. So right now, what you should be seeing, if everything's working properly here, is a negative feedback loop of what's going on with the thyroid. The brain's on top. Specifically, then you've got the pituitary, which is also in the brain, the thyroid, and then your bloodstream at the bottom. It's a black and white picture. Hopefully you guys are seeing that. Let's see, just making sure here. All right, so let me show you what's going on here. So TRH is thyroid releasing hormone, and that's really released by the hypothalamus. Okay, and that hypothalamus releases this to the secrete or to the signal the pituitary to release TSH. Okay, so the pituitary here releases TSH. So let me go back. TRH stands for thyroid releasing hormone. Okay, TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, this is a marker that you probably have already seen on your lab test and lab markers. Okay, so this TSH, typically a good functional range for TSH is 1.8 to 3.0. Okay, and that's that thyroid stimulating hormone that signals your thyroid to release your thyroid hormones. Okay, now the thyroid hormones are T4 and T3. Okay, now really the only difference between the two is one iodine group. T4 has 4 iodine groups and T3 has 3 iodine groups. Okay, T4 is inactive, T3 is active, meaning it can bind to receptors. And that's really the name of the game here, is you need to bind to a receptor and activate that receptor to make anything happen. Okay, without that receptor activation, you can have all the thyroid hormones floating around, but if you're not activating those thyroid receptors, you're not accomplishing anything. So this is really that lock and key mechanism is that on switch to turn on and speed up metabolism, okay? Now going back to this, the T4 is roughly, so your thyroid is going to make about 90 to 93% T4, okay? And then the T3 is only about 10 to 7%, okay? Now of that T4, only about, I'd say about 60% is roughly going to be converted into T3, okay? And that T3 conversion happens in the gut, happens in your liver, in your tissues, as your body needs it, okay? Now, the other 40% is basically divided into reverse T3, and then also what's called T3 sulfate and T3 acetic acid, okay? Now, the main thing here that you need to know is that the reverse T3, once it's converted into reverse T3, it can no longer be activated. It's just kind of stuck in limbo. That T3 or reverse T3 can't become T3 active, okay? Once it's reverse T3, it's totally inactive and it can't convert back. The T3 sulfate and T3 acetic acid, that can be converted into active T3, and that active T3 can then obviously bind to receptors, okay? Again, that conversion relies on specific enzymes and specific tissues in the body. So that's basically where that happens, okay? Now, the markers that are going to affect your thyroid hormones and just your thyroid panel overall are insulin and cortisol. So we've kind of talked about this in the first series. We talked about insulin resistance and hypoglycemia and how that affects the cortisol levels and stress. There's going to be hormones, the testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. These do have an impact on your thyroid receptors. And you have to also kind of consider, and I've probably already mentioned this before, that all of your hormones, they're kind of all like musical instruments in a symphony or in an orchestra. They all have to be released at a specific time, and they all have to be released in specific quantities for you to basically function and express life to the optimal levels. If you have a mistiming, or if you don't have enough quantity of one versus another, it's just like an orchestra where the violin is off timing, or the drums are off timing, or whatever it is. It just doesn't sound like it's good music. And that's basically what can happen when your whole system is imbalanced. And so you kind of have to get all these circadian rhythms back into normal function, and get these hormone levels back up to kind of achieve that homeostasis and basically start expressing life to its full capacity again. Okay, binding proteins are also going to affect thyroid markers, and I'll go into this a little bit more in the specific labs, specifically with T3 uptake, because binding proteins have they bind to the thyroid hormones. And when these thyroid hormones are bound, okay, so let me go back a little bit. In order for your thyroid, once it starts to release T3s and T4s, it needs to travel through your bloodstream. It needs to travel to your brain, to your eyes, to a cell in your foot. And in order to do that, it needs binding proteins to do it. So think of this as your Uber driver, okay? And so the thyroid hormones have to bind to these Uber drivers or to these proteins to basically get to where they are needed. And sometimes you can have an overabundance of these binding proteins. And if these binding proteins are basically not allowing the thyroid hormones to unbind, then you can have a large amount of thyroid hormones, but still, they're bound to proteins and they're not activating any receptors. And again, if they're not activating any receptors, you're going to express hypothyroid symptoms, even though that you've got, normal amounts of thyroid hormones. Most of them may be bound, okay? Inflammation can also impact, obviously, TSH secretion, okay? So the pituitary, which we looked at again here, the pituitary here is highly, highly sensitive to inflammation, which are basically cytokine signals that come from your immune cells, blood sugar and cortisol. These are also things that can basically throw off this negative feedback loop from working properly. Okay, so that's another thing that you definitely need to keep in mind when you're looking at, or trying to interpret your own thyroid labs. Then there's the enzymes. The enzymes, again, when converting into T4 into T3, the specific enzyme is a deiodinase enzyme, meaning it's basically removing an iodine group, okay? And so sometimes that may be ineffective, and that's something that you definitely want to look at when you have an overabundance of T3 or T4, but not enough T3, and that could be what's called an underconversion. And then your microbiome. So your microbiome, again, these are the bacteria that line or that are basically part of us. Majority of them are in our intestinal lining. There's so much research right now in our microbiome population. There's studies that indicate that the microbiome is really essential for metabolism, and fat burning, and weight loss. And it's these bacteria that also produce our neurotransmitters that are then transported through the gut and to the brain. And so, we're just kind of really at the infancy of the research when it comes to the microbiome, but I think that really is where our research is headed. And I think our health relies on our gut health. And so really to get these micro or different bacterial species, as diverse as we possibly can and as abundant as we can possibly can, will really, really have an impact on our health. Okay, so going back to this picture here, this again is just a colored picture of what we just went over in the previous diagram. This is a more close-up view of the negative feedback loop. Again, this up here is your hypothalamus, your pituitary is here, and your thyroid, okay? So your hypothalamus secretes that TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, and then that TSH, or then that pituitary then secretes TSH to signal the thyroid, which then makes T4 and T3, okay? Now, this is kind of the thermostat in your room. Now, I know we've all been kind of in this cold freeze or Arctic freeze here lately. Well, not so much here in San Diego, but in other parts of the country. You have a thermostat, and when the temperature drops too low, your heater kicks on and basically turns on, the heat automatically. And this is basically the thermostat inside your body here, okay? When your brain senses that you don't have enough T3 or T4 going on, then it turns on this whole loop to basically tells the hypothalamus to secrete TRH, which then helps, again, secretes TSH, and then you get more T3 and T4. Okay, so that's how that works. If you've got too much T3 and T4 floating around, then this switch is turned off. It's why it's called a negative feedback inhibition. Okay, that switch is turned off, and so you have less TRH, which means that you have less TSH, which means that you have less T3 and T4 floating around. Okay, so that's kind of how this negative feedback loop works. Okay, now this group obviously is mainly concerned with hypothyroid. Okay, and whenever you have to kind of remember or understand that the thyroid has receptors, or the thyroid hormone has receptors to every single cell in our body. Okay, so everything is going to be impacted if you're hypothyroid. Now, these are just the main kind of, building points that I wanted to point out here, but it will have an impact on bone metabolism. Okay, if you're hypothyroid, it's going to have you're going to see maybe a decrease or an increase in your calcium, your serum calcium levels. Okay, that might be out of functional range, and as a result, you might have bone, or your bone metabolism is off, and you might have weak bones as a result. Okay, and so that's not really something that you want to have as you get older, because hip fractures occur at a alarming rate, And that's once you have a hip fracture, your quality of life is totally decreased, and in most cases, it's severely debilitating. Obviously, people just don't recover from that. Okay. Gut motility, it's going to have an impact on that. So everything is just kind of slowed down with gut motility. Again, when you're the thyroid, it's basically kind of an on switch to kind of speed everything up or have everything working at full capacity. Without your thyroid hormone, you're probably working at 60 to 70%, maybe even lower capacity. And as a result, everything is just kind of slowed down. So you tend to also have, gallstones, or you tend to develop gallbladder issues. And one of the questionnaires that, I ask with all my patients is, do you still have your gallbladder? Because a lot of times they just end up removing your gallbladder, even though they've never fully addressed what's going on with why your gallbladder was diseased in the first place. And in most cases, those were related to hypothyroid issues. Okay. Homocysteine levels can also have an impact. So you can have a rise in homocysteine because of this. And again, homocysteine is one of those that really creates inflammation in our arteries, and it really creates those nicks and cuts, and then can lead to cardiovascular issues. Okay. Anemia, we've talked about this anemia already. You can get different types of anemia, but when your red blood cells aren't getting even the bone marrow aren't getting the inputs from the thyroid that it needs, you typically get some type of an anemia going on. Okay. The hormones, we've kind of already touched on this already. The testosterone, the estrogens, the progesterones, all of that can be impacted with being hypothyroid. So it's, if you've got some hormonal issues, that's definitely something that you want to correct, because not only there's, these things, I know I have got the hypothyroid here in the center. One of these things could be in the center and replace each other, and then also affect the thyroid function. Okay. Neurotransmitters. Okay. These are the basic chemicals in your brain that whether produce happiness, that produce, our joy of living, our zest for life. A lot of these times, these neurotransmitters can be depressed. And as a result, you end up being depressed. Okay. And then, the insulin and the cortisol as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but that leads to blood sugar and adrenals. You can have insulin resistance or hypoglycemia. And then also that's going to have an impact on your cortisol, which has an impact on your, energy levels throughout the day. Okay. All right. So the TSH, so these are the basic lab markers, or these right here are the functional ranges. Okay. And TSH, we already talked about. This is that thyroid stimulating hormone. Total T4 is basically the amount of T4 that's floating around in your body, bound and free. Okay. Whereas free T4 obviously is just the free T4. It doesn't account for the bound T4. Okay. Same thing with total T3 and free T3. Okay. So when you see total, it just means that it's bound to proteins and also the free fraction. Okay. The reverse T3, we talked about that already. Again, that's roughly about 20% of the T4 is going to be reverse T3. And here are your functional ranges for that. The T3 uptake, again, this is kind of an indirect marker for, binding proteins. Okay. So these are the amounts of binding proteins that can occur. And you really have to kind of look at that, because again, if the thyroid hormone is bound to specific proteins, it can't activate or it can't bind to a receptor. Okay. And then these are your TPO and antithyroid globulin antibodies. Obviously, these are your markers for Hashimoto's. There is also a TSI, which I did not include here, but that's primarily for Graves' disease. Okay. So, let's go into the panels now and what you're actually going to see. Now, there's different types of thyroid panels, and we'll get this one over with now, because I doubt that this affects the majority of the population with the Hashimoto's group here, but you can have Graves and you can also have Hashimoto's at the same time, okay? But anyways, with hyperthyroid, meaning that your thyroid is producing too much T3 and T4, that's going to have a negative feedback, and as a result, you're going to see a low TSH level, okay? Now, again, this is independent of any type of medication or anything, because medications can also drive low TSH, okay? This is if you weren't taking medications, if you were just kind of doing labs for the first time and you didn't know what was going on, you have low TSH and the rest of your thyroid markers are normal or elevated, you could be hyperthyroid. And your symptoms are going to be increased heart rate, the heart palpitations, the anxiety, the inward trembling, and the insomnia. Okay. The main thing I want you guys to look at or to basically understand is if you are hyperthyroid, this is a much more critical condition than hypothyroid. Okay. So you really need to get help out there. You're at a risk of just all kinds of things when you're hyperthyroid. Okay. So I encourage you guys to basically seek medical care if you've got a hyperthyroid or Graves' disease issue. Okay. All right, so now we get into the hypothyroid patterns, and there's different ones, okay? And so, and each one is gonna have different types of treatments or cares or protocols for it. So you really need to understand what type of hypothyroid pattern that you have. And there's a primary hyperthyroid, there's a secondary, underconversion, overconversion, again, the binding proteins, and then the thyroid resistance. Now, we'll go over all of these a little bit more in detail. When you're autoimmune or Hashimoto's hypothyroid, you can have one or all of these going on, okay? And so that's when it becomes a complicated issue, and then that's when it, you know, it probably would benefit you to work with somebody to do that, to kind of unravel all these different webs and complexities that you have, okay? But for some or most, you're either expressing one or two of these things, and it's kind of, if you are, it's really easy to kind of unravel as long as you know what's going on there, okay? So the primary hypothyroid panel that you're gonna see is a high TSH, okay? So remember, you don't have enough T3 and T4 going on, so your brain senses that, so it's trying to signal your thyroid to pump more T3 and T4, and so you're gonna have elevated TSH, and that's really only the primary kind of marker that you're going to need for primary hypothyroid is a high TSH, okay? The rest of your thyroid panel is going to be either normal or low, okay? Now, obviously, you guys probably already know the symptoms: fatigue, brain fog, thinning hair and eyebrows, especially in the distal thirds of the eyebrows, cold extremities, the mood swings, the slower metabolism, the inability to lose weight, okay? It's not true for everybody, but you know, there are obviously some patients out there who are hypothyroid and are, you know, 15 to 20 pounds below their normal weight, okay? And that may be due more to that microbiome issue that can have an impact on that. But typically, you know, in most cases, you might see that the hypothyroid patient has the inability to lose weight and maybe, you know, 10 to 20 pounds overweight, okay? All right, secondary hypothyroidism, okay? So secondary hypothyroidism is from low TSH, which means there's low T3 and T4. Now, if we look at this negative feedback diagram again, we mentioned earlier that this is going to be, this pituitary is highly sensitive to cortisol, to inflammation, and to blood sugar, okay? And as a result, it doesn't allow this negative feedback mechanism to work. So even though the body is trying to signal that there's low T3 and T4s, it's not getting that because of the inflammation, the cortisol, and the blood sugar issues are blocking those signals from getting to the pituitary. And as a result, you're gonna have low TSH as well, okay? So that's really what's going on here with this secondary hypothyroidism. It's caused by inflammation, blood sugar imbalances, and elevated cortisol. So you've really got to look at those factors and start really working on minimizing inflammation, you know, in your body, whether it's inflammation through the gut, whether it's inflammation through stress, or it's inflammation through, chronic fluctuations or up and down patterns with your insulin. Those are all things that can be impacting the pituitary from releasing TSH. Okay. Obviously, all the symptoms are going to be hypothyroid symptoms that we just mentioned and talked about in the previous slide. So that's the whole thing with secondary hypothyroidism. Okay. All right. Thyroid underconversion. Okay. So this is where you have plenty of T4, but you don't have enough T3 floating around. Okay. And that basically indicates that, your body or your thyroid is making the T4 that it needs, but it's just not being converted into T3. Okay. So you're going to have normal TSH, normal T4, but you're going to have low T3. Okay. Again, this can also be caused by high cortisol and inflammation, which inhibits the deiodinase enzyme. Okay. Again, that the main differences between T4 and T3 is an iodine group. And so a deiodinase enzyme basically removes that iodine group. And as a result, you have an active T4 or active T3. Okay. So sometimes this can be fixed by a simple supplement that provides you with that deiodinase enzyme. Or sometimes it's a little bit more complex than that, and you have to really look at, again, the underlying issues of inflammation that's your body is producing. Okay. Another pattern is you get a thyroid overconversion. Okay. Now, an overconversion obviously is just the opposite of an underconversion. You're producing more T3 than what you want. Okay. Well, then you might say, well, isn't that a good thing then? Isn't it good to have more T3 floating around? Well, yes and no. There is a point where it becomes overkill. And as a result, when you've got too much T3 floating around, you have what's called a downregulation of your receptors. Okay. So meaning that you have less receptors that can bind to the thyroid hormone or the T3 hormone. Okay. And remember, the big picture is receptor activation. Can't stress that enough. Receptor activation. If you don't have enough of those receptors that are able to bind to the thyroid hormones or the T3 hormones, then you're just going to have, again, the symptoms of being hypothyroid. Okay. This is usually caused by elevated testosterone, again, secondary to insulin resistance. We talked about this in the very beginning. Excuse me, or in the beginning of the first webinar where I talked about insulin patterns. So when you have insulin resistance or chronically insulin resistance in females, it can actually turn off an enzyme and activate your thecal cells to start producing testosterone as opposed to estrogens. And so these things lead to PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome. Don't want to go into too much detail with that, but you can refer to the first webinar series that we did last month on that. Okay. All right. Estrogen dominance. So this is quite the opposite of what we just talked about being testosterone dominant. Now you have an estrogen dominance going on. Again, like we talked about earlier, with hormones, everything has to be in balance. It has to perform like a musical, orchestra. And if you have, levels that aren't balanced, or if they're being released at a different time, you're going to express poor health and maybe disease. Okay. So with estrogen dominance, what can happen is you can actually have an overabundance of binding proteins, okay? And these binding proteins basically take up, whoa, I think my voice just cracked there. Excuse me. You can actually take up more of the thyroid hormones, okay? So you've got basically more Uber drivers to take these thyroid hormones to your body, but it doesn't let them out. Okay. And as a result, again, it can't bind to receptors. Okay. And so the big thing that you're going to see here is you're going to see the T3 uptake. Excuse me. Let me get a drink here. All right. So you're going to see low T3 uptake. Okay, and that's going to tell you, or might indicate to you that, hey, you might have a hormone imbalance issue here. Let's move forward with this and let's start identifying what's going on with your hormones. Okay, because with estrogen dominance, you're going to have normal TSH, normal T3 and T4. The only thing that's really going to seem off is this T3 uptake. Okay, and again, if you look, you might have an increase in thyroid binding proteins. Leads to decreased free T3 and T4. Okay, this can result from elevated estrogen secondary to estrogen replacement therapy. That's what ERT is. Okay, birth control, or even pregnancies. Okay, so these are the things that can happen, with the estrogen dominance here. Okay, moving along. You can also get thyroid resistance, okay? And now with thyroid resistance, basically this is kind of like the same thing with insulin resistance. It's that lock and key mechanism with the thyroid hormone not being able to bind properly to the thyroid receptor. And as a result, you've got ample amounts of thyroid hormones floating around, but again, it's not activating the receptors. And so you're going to express hypothyroid symptoms, okay? And so in this pattern, you typically have normal TSH, normal T3 and T4, but again, your T3 does not bind to those receptors. Typically, this is caused by elevated homocysteine, okay? So you've got to look at your homocysteine numbers again. It can be caused by high cortisol and low vitamin A, okay? So a way to look at high cortisol or cortisol patterns in your body is to do what's called, well, you can do it in several ways. You can do a blood test, obviously. A blood test is not going to give you a really, good indication of what's going on with your cortisol levels, because it's just one reading at one specific time. You can do an ASI, which is a salivary index or adrenal salivary index test, where you're doing saliva samples over a 24-hour period. And then you can check your cortisol levels that way. That does give you a free fraction as well. And you can also do what's called a dry urine test, which is what's called the Dutch test. And that measures what you're actually metabolizing and using. Again, that's over a 24-hour period. You do one in the morning when you wake up, mid-morning at lunch, afternoon, and in the evening. And that way you can actually graph out where your cortisol levels are. So that might be a kind of a good thing to do if you suspect some type of a cortisol issue or a overactive stress response or something going on with your hormones. Okay, and then obviously there's the autoimmune thyroid pattern. Okay, this is the last kind of pattern that you'll see, and it could be any one of these or it could be all of these that we just talked about. Okay, all right. So that is all I have for now. I promised myself and I promised a few of the members that I'd keep this presentation around 30 minutes because the other one, we tried to do it under 30 minutes and it was way over that. We went, I think, over an hour. So 30 minutes, nice and short. If you want to get a little bit more information on this, my mentor is Dr. Karazian, Dr. Datis Karazian. This is all in his thyroid book, okay? This is just kind of a brief overview of that, and hopefully, kind of like a Cliff Notes version of that, so you get the gist of what's going on. But that is all I have for now, and I will then go into the questions part. I think the mods have been sending me questions. I've heard the beeping, and so I'll get to that. Okay. Let me see if I can get out of this.